Have you ever noticed that, like when we talk about the history of philosophy, we often kind of jump straight from the ancient Greeks to the Islamic Golden Age?
Yeah.
It's like there's this huge gap in between. And like, how did those philosophical ideas survive? Especially something as complex as like Aristotle's theories. How did those make it through those turbulent centuries?
It's a question that has baffled scholars for ages.
Yeah.
It really is. Um, how did this complex system of thought not just survive, but
Right.
flourish?
Like, it feels like there's a missing piece of the puzzle.
Mm,
Well, today we are diving deep into the work of scholar John Watt, who believes he's found the answer.
okay.
Syriac scholars.
Interesting.
They acted as this bridge, keeping that flame of Aristotelian thought alive, and they even ended up influencing Islamic thought in ways you might not expect.
That's fascinating.
Watt's article, The Syriac Aristotle Between Alexandria and Baghdad, really lays out a compelling case.
Okay.
He starts by presenting this like intriguing mystery. You have these two major centers of Aristotelian philosophy. 6th century Alexandria, where Greek was the main language,
Right.
and then centuries later, 9th and 10th century Baghdad, where the language is Arabic.
Yeah.
But the old theory that the Alexandrian school just like physically relocated to Baghdad, debunked.
Oh, wow.
So how do we connect these two seemingly like separate centers of thought?
Yeah, that's a great question.
That's where these Syriac scholars come in, right?
Okay.
They were fluent in both Greek and Syriac,
Wow.
which like uniquely positioned them to study and translate those Greek works,
Okay.
including, those all-important writings of Aristotle.
Makes sense.
So they basically became like guardians of knowledge
Yeah.
during this like period of just immense upheaval.
Right.
But it's important to remember they weren't just copying texts.
Oh, yeah.
They were actively engaging with these ideas
Okay.
and shaping how they were understood and transmitted.
I see.
Watt points to this fascinating figure,
Uh-huh.
Sergius of Rashena, as a key player in all of this.
Sergius of Rashena.
Yeah.
So what's his story?
Well, Sergius was a 6th century scholar who studied in Alexandria under Ammonius, who was like a leading commentator on Aristotle.
Oh, wow.
So talk about a direct link to the source.
Yeah, for sure.
This connection is vital because it demonstrates that lineage of knowledge.
Absolutely.
So we have a direct link back to the heart of Aristotelian thought in Alexandria.
Okay.
So what did Sergius do with all this knowledge?
Good question.
While he was prolific,
Okay.
he translated works by important figures like Galen and Alexander of Aphrodisios,
Right.
another significant commentator on Aristotle.
Yeah.
He even translated some pseudo-Aristotle.
Pseudo-Aristotle.
Yeah. Works attributed to Aristotle, but likely written by others.
Oh, so like early academic fan fiction.
Yeah, you could say that.
Uh-huh.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Sergius wrote a Syriac commentary on Aristotle's categories, but he expected his readers to refer back to the original Greek text.
Wait, so he's writing in Syriac, but assumes his audience is comfortable enough with Greek to just like flip back and forth.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
It really highlights this like bilingual, intellectually vibrant world of Syriac scholarship. They weren't just translating, for those who couldn't read Greek.
Right.
They were building on the Greek tradition and making it accessible to a wider audience.
I see.
So Sergius is bridging these two worlds, these two languages.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
It is.
But what else makes him so important? It sounds like he was a busy scholar,
He was.
and one of his most significant contributions
Okay.
was his translation of the entire corpus of Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite,
Wow.
a Christian thinker who was deeply influenced by Neoplatonism.
Neoplatonism.
Yeah.
So that's like a more mystical, spiritual interpretation of Plato, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is crucial because in his preface, Sergius actually lays out his own curriculum,
Okay.
blending the Aristotelian philosophical tradition with the Christian mysticism of Pseudo-Dionysius.
Interesting.
What he's doing is creating a uniquely Syriac philosophical tradition.
So he's not just preserving knowledge.
Right.
He's creating something new.
Exactly.
Wow, that raises an interesting question.
Yeah.
Did this catch on?
Right.
Was this just Sergius's own intellectual experiment?
Yeah.
Or did this synthesis of ideas actually, like, have legs?
That's where the monastery of Kineshir comes in,
Okay.
located on the Euphrates. It became a hub for Syriac scholarship.
I see.
And fascinatingly, 4 prominent 7th century Syriac Aristotelian scholars were all associated with it.
Oh, wow. So Sergius wasn't alone.
No,
This wasn't a one-man show.
not at all.
Tell me more about these scholars at Kineshir.
Okay.
What were their names? What were they known for?
Well, first you have Severus Sabak.
Severus Sebach.
Yeah, who was interested in logic and astronomy.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's Athanasius of Balad.
Athanasius of Balad.
Yeah,
Okay.
known for his translations of several of Aristotle's logical works.
Interesting.
And get this,
What?
his translations were later used by scholars in Baghdad.
Oh, wow.
This is where it all starts to connect to that later flourishing in Baghdad, right?
Yeah,
We're starting to see that bridge emerge.
that connection.
Exactly. We also have Jacob of Edessa at Kenesher,
Uh-huh.
who not only translated categories but also wrote on physics.
Okay.
And finally, there's George Bishop of the Arabs,
Mm-hmm.
who translated and commented on several logical works.
So their interest extended beyond just logic.
Yes.
They were delving into physics and beyond.
Right, and that challenges the idea that they were only interested in, like, the short organon, that, like, truncated version of Aristotle's logical works.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. The evidence points to these scholars grappling with a far wider range of Aristotle's work than was previously thought.
Fascinating.
It sounds like Kenesher was a real intellectual hotbed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
But was all this activity limited to this one monastery?
Right.
Were there other players in this story?
I'm curious to find out.
There were.
Okay.
And it leads us right back to Baghdad.
Okay.
Remember Timothy the
See
First?
the first.
Yeah, the East Syrian patriarch. He resided in Baghdad in the late 8th century.
Yeah.
And he actively sought copies of Aristotle's and Pseudo-Dionysius's works.
So even the patriarch based in Baghdad was interested in this Syriac model
Yeah.
that Sergius had created centuries earlier.
Exactly.
It seems like this approach to learning had incredible staying power.
It did.
Wow.
And it really speaks volumes about the role of these Syriac monasteries as repositories of knowledge.
Yeah.
They were transmitting these ideas across both time and vast geographical distances.
Amazing.
This is incredible.
It is.
We've gone from this one individual, Sergius,
Yeah.
to this entire network of scholars and monasteries,
Yeah.
all dedicated to keeping the works of Aristotle and Pseudo-Dionysius alive.
Mhm.
And they're laying the groundwork for what will become this like vibrant philosophical scene in Baghdad.
Yeah.
It's less of a historical gap and more of a like bustling intellectual highway.
That's a great way to put it.
And as we move into the 9th and 10th centuries, things get even more exciting.
And more exciting.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'm hooked.
That's when Baghdad truly emerges as a center for philosophy.
Yeah.
And guess what?
What?
Syriac scholars are right at the heart of it.
Amazing.
Okay. I'm definitely hooked.
Me too.
Let's hear about Baghdad.
Yeah.
What happens next in this intellectual adventure?
I can't wait to hear. So a key figure in this later Baghdad period is Abu Bishr Mata,
Okay.
a leading scholar among what we call the Baghdad Aristotelians.
Mm-hmm.
He and his students, including the famous Al-Farabi, relied heavily on those Syriac translations of Aristotle we've been discussing.
So this is where that Syriac bridge really comes into focus.
Mm.
It's not just a coincidence.
Mhm.
It's a clear line of intellectual transmission from Alexandria to Baghdad, thanks to those Syriac scholars.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating, if they weren't just inheriting these texts in isolation,
Oh.
they also inherited that Syriac tradition of combining Aristotle with the Christian theological framework.
Interesting.
So this intellectual approach, pioneered by figures like Sergius,
Yeah.
continued to shape how they understood and interpreted Aristotle.
So even though we're now in the heart of the Islamic Golden Age, the influence of these earlier Christian Syriac scholars
Yes.
is still very much present.
It is, and it's remarkable because even Al-Farabi, a Muslim philosopher, explicitly acknowledged the profound influence of his Christian teachers and those Syriac texts. It speaks to the depth of this intellectual exchange
Yeah.
and the lasting impact of that Syriac tradition.
It really highlights how interconnected intellectual history truly is.
It does.
But, you know, speaking of connections, I keep thinking about Sergius's curriculum
Mm-hmm.
and his decision to replace Plato with Pseudo-Dionysius.
Right.
Why do you think he made that choice? It seems pretty significant.
It is significant. It raises all sorts of intriguing questions about the development of philosophical thought.
Yeah.
Remember, Sergius was a Christian operating within a specific theological context.
Right.
So while he was clearly drawn to elements of Neoplatonism,
Uh-huh.
embracing like a fully pagan version of Plato's ideas wouldn't have been possible for him.
So Pseudo-Dionysius provided a way for him to reconcile those philosophical ideas with his Christian faith.
Yes.
He found a way to bring those two worlds together.
Precisely. Pseudo-Dionysius offered a framework that allowed him to engage with Neoplatonic concepts without compromising his religious beliefs.
Right.
And it's worth considering the impact of this choice.
Yeah.
Platonic philosophy, while influential in other spheres, played a relatively minor role in Islamic thought compared to Aristotle.
Huh.
Could Sergius's decision to champion Pseudo-Dionysius over Plato have contributed to that?
That's a fascinating question.
It is.
It's like ripple effect across centuries.
Yeah.
One choice made by a scholar in 6th century Alexandria ends up influencing the trajectory of Islamic philosophy.
Exactly. It highlights the power of seemingly small decisions within intellectual history and how those choices can have long-lasting consequences.
You know, earlier we talked about the debate over whether Syriac scholars were primarily focused on logic and the short organon.
Yeah.
You've seen plenty of evidence pointing to engagement with a broader range of Aristotle's work.
Right.
But it makes you wonder how much evidence is out there that we just haven't found yet.
That's a great point.
Right.
We have to remember how much knowledge has been lost throughout history, especially from the ancient world.
Yeah.
Think about all those libraries that burned down, taking countless texts with them.
It's a shame.
We have to rely on the fragments that remain, the references into other works,
Yeah.
and even secondhand accounts to piece together a complete picture.
It's like working with a giant, partially completed jigsaw puzzle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while we may not have physical copies of every single Syriac translation, we can't assume they didn't exist.
Okay.
The evidence we do have suggests a much wider engagement with Aristotle's work than some scholars previously acknowledged.
Okay.
Remember Jacob of Edessa?
Yeah.
We know he wrote a Hexameron,
Oh, right.
a commentary on the 6 days of creation as described in Genesis.
Yes, the intersection of philosophy and theology.
Exactly.
Can you remind me what a hexameron is?
Sure.
I'm not as familiar with early Christian literature.
Of course. So a Hexameron is a commentary on the 6 days of creation as described in the book of Genesis.
Okay.
It was a popular genre in early Christian writing, and it often involved exploring philosophical and scientific ideas alongside theological interpretations.
So even in their theological writings, these Syriac scholars were weaving together multiple threads of knowledge.
Yeah.
Philosophy, theology, and natural science.
Hmm.
It speaks to a very holistic approach to understanding the world.
Precisely. And that's something we see throughout the Syriac intellectual tradition.
Yeah.
This integration of different areas of knowledge.
Right.
It wasn't about compartmentalizing ideas.
Right.
It was about bringing them together,
Mm-hmm.
seeing how they connected and illuminated one another.
We've talked about physics and theology,
Right.
but what about the rest of Aristotle's works?
Yeah.
Especially those later treatises that came after the Organon?
Mm-hmm.
Is there evidence that they were engaging with those as well?
Remember Timothy I?
Yes.
He wasn't just seeking copies of Aristotle and Pseudo-Dionysius's core works.
Okay.
He was specifically looking for commentaries on Aristotle's topics, sophistical refutations, rhetoric, and even poetics.
Wow.
And he didn't mind whether those commentaries were in Syriac or Greek.
So that means they were at least aware of those works.
Yeah.
And actively trying to find more information about them.
Exactly.
It reinforces the idea that they were not just focused on logic, but were engaging with a broader scope of Aristotle's philosophical system.
You're right, it does.
It's like you said earlier, you don't go looking for the study guide if you haven't even opened the book.
Right.
It just wouldn't make sense.
Right.
Exactly.
But okay, let's shift our focus back to Baghdad.
Okay.
And those later scholars who inherited this Syriac intellectual tradition, we were talking about Abu Bijurmata and the Baghdad Aristotelians.
Right.
What made them so important in this story?
Well, they were pivotal in transmitting these Aristotelian ideas filtered through that Syriac lens to the wider Arab world.
Yep.
Remember, they couldn't read Greek.
Right.
So those Syriac translations were their lifeline to Aristotle.
It's as if those translations became the textbooks for a whole new generation of philosophers in Baghdad.
That's a great way to put it.
They were building upon the foundation laid by those earlier Syriac scholars.
And it's not just about the texts themselves.
Nope.
It's about that whole intellectual framework they inherited.
Yeah.
The Syriac tradition of blending Aristotle with Christian theology continued to shape their understanding and interpretation of his philosophy.
Right.
Even Al-Farabi, who, as we mentioned, was a Muslim, acknowledged the deep influence of those Syriac texts and his Christian teachers. So it's like those ideas became part of the very fabric of their intellectual world.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about studying Aristotle in a vacuum.
Right.
It was about seeing him through this particular lens that had been shaped by centuries of Syriac scholarship.
Exactly.
But this brings up something that's been on my mind.
What's that?
We often hear about Al-Farabi and his connection to Neoplatonism.
Right.
How does that fit into this picture of him being influenced by these Syriac Christian thinkers who were more focused on Aristotle?
That's a great question, and it points to the complex and often nuanced ways in which intellectual traditions evolve.
Yeah.
It's possible that Al-Farabi encountered those pagan Neoplatonic sources later in his life
Mm.
and kind of integrated them into his existing framework.
Okay.
But it also raises the question of whether there were already some subtle strands of Neoplatonic thought present within those Syriac Christian circles.
Yeah.
Remember, figures like Sergius were clearly drawn to certain aspects of Neoplatonism, even as they sought to reconcile them with their Christian faith.
So maybe Al-Farabi's interest in Neoplatonism wasn't a sudden departure from his earlier influences,
Right.
but rather a continuation of a line of thought that was already present within that Syriac tradition.
Exactly. It's a reminder that intellectual journeys are rarely straightforward.
Mm.
They often involve weaving together multiple threads of thought, drawing inspiration from different sources,
Yeah.
and finding ways to reconcile seemingly disparate ideas.
It really makes you appreciate the complexity and richness of intellectual history.
It does.
There are always more connections to discover, more layers to uncover.
Absolutely.
I completely agree. It's a constant process of discovery and reinterpretation.
It is.
But let's not lose sight of the incredible journey we've already taken.
Right.
We've traced the path of Aristotelian thought from 6th century Alexandria to 9th and 10th century Baghdad,
Yeah.
highlighting the essential role of those often overlooked Syriac scholars.
Hmm?
They weren't just passive translators,
Right.
they were active thinkers who shaped how these ideas were understood and transmitted, laying the foundation for that flourishing of philosophy in the Islamic Golden Age.
It truly is remarkable. We've watched a whole intellectual ecosystem take shape,
Yeah.
one that spans centuries and cultures.
And at the heart of it all are these dedicated Syriac scholars who kept the flame of knowledge burning bright.
They did.
But where do we go from here?
Yeah, good question.
What are some of the key takeaways from this deep dive?
I think one of the most important takeaways is, the reminder that intellectual history isn't a neat and tidy, like linear progression.
Right.
It's messy.
Yeah.
It's interconnected, and it's full of surprises.
Yeah, for sure.
We often think of ideas as belonging to specific cultures or time periods,
Mm-hmm.
but this story really shows us just how fluid and interconnected they really are.
It's like we've been following these threads of thought as they weave their way through, different languages, different cultures, and even religions.
Exactly. And it challenges us to think more critically about the assumptions we often make,
Right.
about the history of ideas.
Yeah.
We can't just focus on the big names
Mm-hmm.
or the dominant narratives.
Yeah.
We need to look deeper,
Okay.
explore those hidden pathways,
Mm.
and really appreciate the contributions
Mm.
of those who've been overlooked or marginalized.
It makes you wonder what other intellectual treasures are waiting to be discovered.
It does.
If we just shift our perspective a little.
It's an exciting thought, isn't it?
It is.
There's so much more to explore.
Yeah.
But, let's not forget the incredible find we've already unearthed.
Right.
This story of the Syriac scholars
Yeah.
and their pivotal role in shaping the course of philosophical thought.
It truly is a story that deserves to be told and celebrated.
It is.
But before we wrap up,
Okay.
I'd love to bring it back to our listener.
Yeah.
What does all of this mean for them?
Mhm.
Why should they care about these long-gone Syriac scholars?
Well, for one thing, I think it encourages us to cultivate intellectual humility.
Okay.
It's easy to get caught up in our own perspectives
Yeah.
and our assumptions.
Uh-huh.
But this story reminds us that there's always more to learn,
Right.
always different ways of seeing the world.
I like that.
The Syriac scholars were masters of this.
Yeah.
They were open to learning from other traditions,
Mm-hmm.
even those that seemed quite different from their own.
Right.
They weren't afraid to grapple with difficult questions and synthesize those different strands of thought into something new.
It sounds like they really embodied that idea of lifelong learning.
Absolutely. And it's something we can all strive for,
Yeah.
regardless of our background or our interests.
Right.
We should always be curious, always be questioning, and always be open to new perspectives.
That's such an important message,
Yeah.
especially in today's world where it's easy to get stuck in our own echo chambers and filter bubbles.
Right.
But okay, I have one final question that's been bugging me. Throughout this entire deep dive,
What is it?
we've talked a lot about how Sergius replaced Plato with pseudo-Dionysius in his curriculum.
Yeah.
But why?
Right.
What was it about Pseudo-Dionysius that appealed to him so much?
Yeah.
It seems like a significant choice, one with lasting repercussions.
It is a significant choice, and I think the answer lies in understanding the context of Sergius's world.
Okay.
Remember, he was a Christian living in a time when the boundaries between the pagan philosophical tradition and the burgeoning Christian theological framework were still being negotiated.
Right.
While Sergius was clearly drawn to Neoplatonic ideas,
Yeah.
embracing Plato in his entirety, with all the baggage of pagan mythology and cosmology, wouldn't have been possible for him.
So Pseudo-Dionysius offered him a way to engage with those Neoplatonic concepts he found so compelling, while remaining firmly rooted in his Christian worldview.
Exactly. Pseudo-Dionysius provided that perfect middle ground. And I think it speaks to the deeply personal nature of intellectual journeys.
Yeah.
Our choices about what we read, what we study, and what we believe are often shaped by our individual experiences, our values, and our search for meaning in the world.
It makes you wonder what Sergius would think.
Yeah.
If he could see how his decision made centuries ago ended up shaping the course of Islamic philosophy.
Pretty amazing.
It's a powerful reminder that our intellectual choices can have far-reaching consequences.
They can.
That extend far beyond our own time and place.
Absolutely. It truly is a humbling thought.
It is.
But I think it's also a reminder that intellectual history is still being written.
Yeah.
Every day, new connections are made, new insights are uncovered, and new interpretations emerge.
It's like we're all part of this ongoing conversation that stretches back centuries and will continue long after we're gone.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And on that note, I'd like to leave our listener with something to ponder. We've discussed how Sergius brought together Aristotle and the Christian mysticism of Pseudo-Dionysius.
Right.
But what other intellectual mergers might be out there? What happens when we bring seemingly disparate traditions into conversation with each other?
Yeah.
What new insights or perspectives might emerge?
That's a fantastic question. I think I'll be mulling that over for quite a while.
I suspect our listener will be too.
Oh.
It's been an absolute pleasure diving deep with you today.
The pleasure was all mine. Until next time, keep those intellectual gears turning.